The night of June 5, 1944, settled with an eerie stillness along the Caen Canal in Normandy. It was the kind of quiet that felt unnatural, as though the landscape itself had been ordered to remain silent. A thin mist clung to the surface of the dark water, drifting lazily between the banks. The only sounds were the faint lap of canal water against concrete pilings and the occasional croak of frogs hidden in the marshy ground nearby. There was no wind, no distant gunfire, no aircraft overhead, just silence. Inside the concrete pillbox on the western bank of the canal, Gefreiter Vera Kortenhaus, 43 years old, shifted his weight and glanced down at his watch. He had been conscripted from a factory job in Stuttgart, drafted late into the war when younger men were already gone. The luminous hands showed 20 minutes past midnight. 4 hours remained until the end of his shift. 4 hours of waiting in a sector everyone insisted was quiet. The bridge itself was a purely utilitarian structure. 150 meters of steel and reinforced concrete, stretching across the canal, linking inland roads to the coast. It was vital for the movement of troops and supplies, though few of the men guarding it felt that importance personally. To the roughly 50 soldiers assigned to its defense, older men, reservists, and conscripts deemed unfit for the Eastern Front, it was simply another posting, another stretch of uneventful guard duty. They had been told repeatedly that Normandy was calm. The real war was elsewhere, in the frozen hell of Russia, in the mountains of Italy, anywhere but here. This was supposed to be a backwater, a place to hold until the war resolved itself far away. A short distance from the bridge stood a small cafe. Beneath it, in a cramped cellar, the Gondry family huddled together. Georges Gondry, the cafe's owner, had sent his wife Thérèse and their 2 young daughters underground hours earlier. For months, Georges had quietly fed information to the French resistance, counting German troops, watching defensive positions grow, memorizing patrol schedules. He had learned to observe without being seen. Tonight, something felt different. He could not explain it. But the air itself felt tense, as if the night were holding its breath. High above the English Channel, at 3,000 feet, Major John Howard, 30 years old, sat inside the lead Horsa glider. His stomach was tight, not with fear exactly, but with anticipation sharpened by months of preparation. Behind him sat 28 men of D Company, 2nd Battalion, Oxfordshire and Buckinghamshire Light Infantry. They sat in silence, faces streaked black with camouflage cream, weapons secured, minds focused. They had rehearsed this mission endlessly, daylight, darkness, rain, fog, until every movement was instinctive. Each man knew his role, his route, his objective. They could execute the plan blindfolded, which was fortunate because in moments they would be landing in total darkness. At 16 minutes past midnight, the Halifax bomber released the tow rope. The sudden silence was absolute. The roar of engines vanished, replaced by a hollow stillness so complete that Staff Sergeant Jim Walwork, the glider pilot, could hear his own breathing. He lowered the nose, committing to the descent, guided only by a stopwatch and landmarks, memorized from grainy aerial photographs. 47 meters from the bridge. That was the target, not 50, not 60. 47 meters. Inside the pillbox, Kortenhaus heard something that did not belong to the night. A rushing sound, like wind tearing through treetops. Yet there were no trees nearby, and the air was still. He stepped outside, squinting into the darkness, trying to locate the source. The sound grew louder, heavier, faster. Something large was descending through the air. "Was es das?" he called out, his voice uncertain. Then the darkness broke. Out of the night sky, the Horsa glider emerged like a monstrous bird, its wide wings silhouetted against the faintly lighter sky. It slammed into the ground with a tremendous crash. The wooden fuselage shattered. The nose tore apart completely. The scream of splintering timber and twisted metal ripped through the quiet night. Courtenhouse stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. The glider skidded violently across the grass, flinging dirt and stones, sliding sideways before grinding to a halt, so close to the bridge that its wingtip nearly brushed the metal railing. 47 meters. Wallwork had hit the mark almost exactly. For a brief moment, perhaps 3 seconds, there was silence once more. Then the side door burst open. Men poured out into the darkness. The men exited the shattered glider with astonishing speed, moving despite the violent impact that had torn the aircraft apart. Training took over, where shock might have slowed lesser soldiers. Lieutenant Den Brotheridge, 26 years old, was the first out, boots hitting the ground hard. His Sten gun was already raised, muzzle flashing as he fired short, controlled bursts toward the bridge. Behind him followed the rest of his platoon, 28 men who had spent 6 months preparing for this precise moment. Inside the pillbox, Courtenhouse finally found his voice. "Fallschirmjäger," he shouted hoarsely. "Paratroopers!" Even as he yelled the warning, confusion twisted in his mind. Paratroopers drifted down slowly beneath white silk canopies. These men had arrived differently, silently, violently, already on the ground, already attacking. Something about this was wrong, terribly wrong. The pillbox machine gun opened fire. Tracer rounds streaked across the bridge in bright arcs of red, but the British were already too close. They pressed themselves against the steel framework, using the bridge's structure for cover as they advanced. Grenades sailed through the firing slit of the pillbox. The explosions hammered the concrete interior. Courtenhouse threw himself backward, ears ringing, vision blurring as smoke and dust filled the cramped space. Almost immediately, 2 more gliders slammed into the ground. One crashed into the marsh with a tremendous splash, water erupting into the air. The other skidded violently near a pond, grinding to a halt in a spray of mud and debris. From both, British soldiers emerged, spreading outward with the same terrifying precision. On the eastern side of the bridge, German defenders suddenly found themselves under attack from multiple directions. Orders were shouted, but there was no time to organize, no time to form a coherent defense. The assault unfolded too fast. Positions that had taken months to prepare were being overrun in seconds. Obergefreiter Heinz Hickman, a 38-year-old former postal worker from Hamburg, had been asleep in a bunker 50 meters from the bridge when the first crash shook him awake. He stumbled outside, still half-dressed, heart pounding, as he tried to understand the chaos exploding around him. He saw British soldiers running across the bridge, saw sharp bursts of muzzle fire, heard men screaming in pain and fear. "Englander!" he shouted to the men behind him. "The English!" By the time Hickman raised his rifle and tried to aim, the British were already past the bridge's midpoint, already clearing pillboxes on the far bank. The fight was slipping away before it had truly begun. From the moment the first glider touched down to the securing of the bridge, less than 10 minutes passed. 10 minutes to capture an objective the Germans had fortified for months. 10 minutes that would shape the entire invasion. In the cellar beneath the Gondry Café, Thérèse Gondry held her daughters tightly as the sounds of battle erupted above them. Gunfire echoed through the building. Explosions rattled the walls. Shouts in German and English overlapped in a terrifying storm of noise. She whispered prayers in French, unsure whether this was liberation or the beginning of brutal reprisals. On the bridge itself, Lieutenant Brotheridge led the charge toward the eastern bank, firing as he ran. A German machine gun position hidden in a trench near the café suddenly opened fire. Brotheridge was struck in the neck and fell forward onto the roadway. He would die minutes later, becoming the first Allied soldier killed on D-Day, having led his men across the bridge he had been sent to seize. The The assault did not slow. Sergeant Wagger Thornton assumed command without hesitation, driving the men forward against the remaining German positions. The British moved with controlled aggression, fast, violent, purposeful. These were not weary garrison troops. These were elite light infantry, trained specifically for this mission, advancing through darkness with total confidence. Dazed and disoriented, Courtenhouse crawled from the damaged pillbox only to find British soldiers already consolidating their positions. A young man, barely 20 years old, aimed a Sten gun at his chest. "Hände hoch!" the soldier shouted in rough German. Courtenhouse raised his hands slowly. Absurdly, he noticed that the British soldier looked as frightened as he felt. The young man's hands trembled, breath coming fast, eyes wide beneath the camouflage paint. But the weapon never wavered. More German soldiers emerged from the darkness, hands raised. Some were wounded. All were stunned. They had expected warning, bombardment, artillery, time to prepare. They had not expected the enemy to arrive out of the night, already among them. Hickman soon found himself herded together with a dozen other German soldiers near the western bank of the canal. British troops moved efficiently around them, weapons at the ready, establishing defensive positions with calm professionalism. A British officer, the man who had clearly led the assault, was issuing orders in a steady voice, directing some men to secure the bridge while others checked desperately for demolition charges that might still be hidden beneath the steel spans. His face was smeared with black camouflage cream, giving his eyes an almost unnatural brightness in the darkness. "Do you speak English?" the officer asked. For a moment, no one answered. Then Karl Schumann, 24 years old, stepped forward slightly and nodded. Before the war, he had worked as a translator. Poor eyesight had kept him from frontline service and placed him instead in this supposedly safe sector. The officer spoke deliberately, ensuring every word could be understood. "Tell them that if they cooperate, they will not be harmed. Tell them we are British paratroopers. Tell them this is the beginning of the invasion of France. And tell them the war is over for them." Schumann swallowed and translated. His voice shook despite his effort to remain composed. Among the prisoners, reactions varied. Some men sagged with relief, shoulders slumping as the tension drained away. Others stared blankly, unable to process what they were hearing. An invasion. Here, now, without warning. Major John Howard, bruised from the crash but otherwise unhurt, moved among his men, checking weapons, counting casualties, ensuring the bridge was secure. 2 soldiers lay dead, including Lieutenant Brotheridge, and several others were wounded. But the objective remained intact. The bridge had been taken whole. Howard pulled out his radio and transmitted the code word that confirmed success: Ham and Jam, both bridges captured. Several kilometers away, at the German regimental headquarters in Ranville, confusion reigned. Fragmented reports arrived almost simultaneously. A bridge under attack, gliders landing, British troops advancing. The duty officer, Captain Klaus Heller, struggled to make sense of the information. How many attackers were there? Where exactly had they landed? He began making frantic telephone calls, attempting to mobilize nearby units. But in the darkness and chaos, coordination came slowly. Back at the bridge, Courtenhouse sat among his fellow prisoners, watching the British dig in with grim efficiency. Everyone knew a counterattack would come. A young British soldier approached and offered him a cigarette. Courtenhouse accepted it with trembling fingers, noticing that the soldier looked young enough to be his son. "Warum?" Courtenhouse asked quietly. "Why?" The soldier did not understand German, but he understood the question. He pointed east toward the coast, then swept his hand forward in a broad motion. Invasion. The answer required no translation. Nearby, Hickman felt a strange sense of relief, mixed with lingering fear. He had been conscripted, dragged away from his postal route in Hamburg, sent to guard a bridge he had never cared about, for a war he no longer believed in. Now it was finished for him. He would survive. Someday he would go home. Schumann, meanwhile, was pulled aside by British officers. They needed information: German troop locations, reserve units, communication lines. He answered honestly. Protecting such information now seemed pointless. It would only lead to more unnecessary deaths. Major Howard treated him with surprising courtesy, even offering tea from a thermos. "You speak excellent English," Howard said. "Where did you learn?" "At university," Schumann replied. "Before the war, I studied literature." "What did you read? Dickens, Hardy, Shakespeare?" Howard smiled faintly, an odd expression given the bodies nearby. "My wife teaches English literature," he said. "She'd like you." The surreal conversation was interrupted by the sound of an approaching engine. A German staff car rolled toward the bridge from the east, unaware it had fallen. British soldiers waited until it was close, then opened fire. The car swerved violently and crashed into a ditch. Its occupants stumbled out, hands raised. Among them was Major Hans Schmidt, the officer nominally responsible for the bridge's defense. He had been away handling administrative matters when the attack began. Now he stood before Howard, his face tight with anger and humiliation. Through Schumann, Howard questioned him about reinforcements and defensive positions. Schmidt initially refused, citing his duty as an officer. But when Howard calmly explained the scale of the invasion and the futility of resistance, Schmidt's resolve weakened. He was 52 years old, a veteran of the First World War, and profoundly tired. "We expected you," Schmidt admitted at last. "But not like this, not in gliders, not in the night." Howard answered dryly, "That was rather the point." As the hours passed, more German soldiers were rounded up and brought in under guard. Some arrived defiant, jaws tight, refusing to meet anyone's eyes. Others seemed openly relieved, the fight having ended before they truly understood it had begun. Many were simply confused, still struggling to comprehend how the war had erupted out of complete silence. Among the prisoners were several Polish conscripts, men forced into Wehrmacht service. They surrendered willingly, speaking rapidly among themselves in Polish, some even smiling faintly now that their ordeal was over. One young soldier sat apart from the others, shaking uncontrollably. His name was Friedrich Müller, barely 18 years old. He had been drafted only 6 months earlier and sent to France after minimal training. When the British soldiers burst from the darkness, he had frozen completely, unable to lift his rifle, unable to move his feet. Now he sat with his head buried in his hands, shoulders heaving. "I want to go home," he kept saying softly. "I just want to go home." A British sergeant noticed him. Though he could not understand the words, the meaning was unmistakable. The sergeant knelt briefly, handed Miller a canteen of water, then draped a blanket over his shoulders. He spoke quietly in English, his tone calm and reassuring. Miller did not understand the language, but he understood the gesture. The shaking slowly subsided. Kortenhouse watched all of this with growing disbelief. He had been warned repeatedly that the British were brutal, that they executed prisoners without hesitation. Yet these men, who had stormed the bridge with terrifying speed and precision, were showing restraint and humanity. They were professional, efficient, but not cruel. "They're just soldiers," Kortenhouse murmured to Hickman, keeping his voice low. "Like us." Hickman nodded slowly. "Better trained," he replied. "Much better trained." That was impossible to deny. The British assault had been seamless. Every man had known exactly where to go, exactly what to do. There had been no shouting, no confusion, no wasted movement. The German defense, by comparison, had collapsed almost instantly. Months of preparation had been undone in minutes. As dawn crept over the fields of Normandy, the distant rumble of engines rolled across the countryside. German tanks were finally moving toward the bridge. British soldiers tensed at the sound, checking weapons, positioning anti-tank launchers, preparing for the fight they knew was coming. The prisoners were moved farther from the bridge, guarded closely, while Howard's men strengthened their defenses. Schumann remained in a strange position, still officially a prisoner, yet increasingly essential. He moved between groups, translating orders and questions, helping prevent misunderstandings that might lead to unnecessary violence. "What will happen to us?" one German soldier asked him quietly. Schumann hesitated. "Prison camps," he answered. "In England, most likely. Years, perhaps." The words were heavy, but compared to death, compared to the Eastern Front, they did not sound unbearable. The German counterattack began shortly after dawn. Tanks and infantry advanced toward the bridge, gunfire echoing across the canal. By then, British reinforcements were arriving. Paratroopers from the main drop zones began linking up with Howard's force. Anti-tank guns were dragged into position under fire. From where they were held, the prisoners could hear the battle, but could not see it. The thunder of tank cannons shook the ground. Machine guns rattled endlessly. Mortar rounds thumped into the earth. The fighting surged back and forth for hours in the early morning light, chaotic and violent. But the bridge held. By mid-afternoon, a sound drifted across the canal that none of them expected: bagpipes. Through smoke and dust, Lord Lovat's commandos approached from Sword Beach. At their head marched Piper Bill Millen, playing bluebonnets over the border. The mournful, defiant notes echoed across the bridge, surreal against the backdrop of war. The link-up between the airborne troops and the seaborne forces was complete. Hearing the pipes, something inside Corton House finally gave way. He had known the truth since the first glider appeared, but now he felt it fully. For him, the war was over. Germany had lost. At the cafe beside the bridge, Thérèse Gondry finally emerged from the cellar, blinking in the pale daylight. British soldiers now occupied the building, their uniforms stained with mud and smoke, their faces drawn with exhaustion. Major John Howard, unfailingly courteous, despite the chaos of the previous hours, apologized for the intrusion and for the damage caused during the fighting. Realizing that liberation had truly arrived, that her family had survived the night, Thérèse began to cry openly. She disappeared briefly into the back room and returned carrying bottles of champagne she had hidden away from the Germans. Bottles saved for this exact moment. She shared them with the British soldiers, who had freed her home, laughing and crying at the same time. Later that day, the German prisoners were marched away under guard, beginning their long journey to prisoner-of-war camps in England. As they walked, they passed endless columns of Allied troops moving inland, tanks, trucks, artillery, and soldiers stretching far beyond the horizon. Some prisoners watched in despair, understanding the scale of what had begun. Others felt a deep, quiet relief. Surely the war could not continue much longer now. Schumann, walking among the prisoners, thought back to his conversation with Major Howard, about literature, about wives, about the strange civility that could exist even in the midst of war. Corton House thought of the young British soldier whose hands had trembled as he aimed his weapon, of the cigarette shared in the darkness, of the bagpipes echoing across a bridge paid for in blood. Hickman would eventually return to Hamburg to find his city shattered, his familiar postal route erased by bombing. He would help rebuild, delivering mail through streets slowly rising from ruins. When his children were old enough, he would tell them that he had been captured on D-Day at a bridge in Normandy, and that the men who captured him had treated him with unexpected decency. Friedrich Müller, the frightened boy, would spend 3 years in a prison camp in England. He would learn English there, and after the war he would immigrate to America, building an entirely new life. He would rarely speak of his brief, terrifying experience as a soldier, but he would never forget the British sergeant who had given him water and a blanket when he was at his lowest. Major John Howard would return to Pegasus Bridge many times in the years after the war. He would attend commemorations and reunions, meeting former enemies who had once defended the bridge. They would shake hands, share memories, and marvel at how young they had all been, how history had turned on 10 violent minutes in the darkness. The bridge itself became a symbol, renamed Pegasus Bridge after the winged horse emblem of the British Airborne forces. It marked the beginning of the end of the war in Western Europe. Though the original bridge was later replaced and moved to a museum, the site remains marked and remembered. But on the night of June 5th, the German defenders knew nothing of symbolism or legacy. They knew only fear, confusion, and sudden violence. They had shouted warnings into the darkness, fought briefly against overwhelming odds, and surrendered to an enemy who proved not to be monsters of propaganda, but soldiers, young men doing their duty with discipline and restraint. "Was ist das?" Kortenhaus had cried when the glider first appeared. It was history arriving without warning, the beginning of the end. War in its rawest form, violent, terrifying, and deeply human. The bridge still stands, and sometimes on quiet nights it feels as though the air itself remembers. The rush of gliders out of darkness, shouted orders in 2 languages, and the moment when the longest night of the 20th century truly began.